in the aftermath of one hijacking. In my earliest memory, the world is the size of one cramped room, the room that I recognize in retrospect as my father's study in our house in Riga. I had barely turned 3 years old when my father abandoned my mother and me and ran away to Leningrad. The warm glow at the center of this memory issues from a wood-burning stove lit in the evenings when my father was home and working. Stacks of books around and underneath his desk, my fortress and my cruise ship at once. I was allowed to stay in his study as long as I kept quiet and didn't move. Sit here, son, and play quietly. The few words I still remember in Russian. Сиди, молчи, Женя, сиди, молчи. My father, a pair of oversized boots of wool felt, valenki. Those boots were the only part of him I could see from my fortress under his desk. The boots made it seem like his feet were permanently attached to the floorboards, that they were part of the building's structure, as immovable as the stove or the walls. How to reconcile this image from my childhood with that of the unemployed alcoholic, the man I knew in my teens? 6 years after my mother and I had come to Israel, he reappeared in our lives a complete stranger. My father, the unsuccessful immigrant, unable to learn the language of the country that had graciously accepted him, for years just getting by on one security guard job or another, leeching off his friends, begging my mother for money years after they had split up. He stayed in the basement of the house that my mother was paying for, even after Pierre, her boyfriend, moved in. My father, the stranger who dared to yell at my mother, he got drunk and yelled at her, faulting her for failing to teach me Russian. But it had not been my mother's decision, I told him. It was my own. Why would I want to learn the language of the country that expelled us, that robbed me of my father? His drinking buddies kept saying to me, "Your father is a great man, a poet, a thinker," and they patted me on the shoulder and gave him money every year, less and less. And he spent it all on alcohol, bottles of the crudest vodka. My father stayed in his basement and leafed through the few volumes of poetry he had managed to bring when he was finally allowed to come here. He said he could remember all he needed to know, and at times tried to recite it to me by heart. Буря мглою небо кроет, but I didn't understand, and eventually he would falter and break it off. And now, this new information from my father's would-be biographer that he was a dissident, a refusnik. One evening, a woman shows up at the door of my mother's house, saying she wants to devote a chapter of her book to my father's life. The word hijacking makes me shudder. Hijacking, isn't it what terrorists do? My mother has invited the woman into our kitchen where we're having dinner, but she soon regrets the hospitality. Your father was a criminal, my mother tells me. He and his friends decided they could hijack a Soviet plane and take it to Israel. Only because they weren't allowed out. Your husband was a political enemy of a criminal state, the woman defends. My mother stands up, forcing our visitor to do the same. My son was too little to understand this at the time, she says. The 6 years, the time it took my father to join us in Israel, apparently he was in the labor camps. In Siberia, I ask? My mother wants this conversation over and almost pushes the woman out the door. No, in Volогодskaya Oblast. It's not too far from Leningrad. The woman is still speaking as my mother closes and locks the front door. I I gather the details online. In 1970, a few Soviet Zionists and dissidents from Riga established a connection with a group in Leningrad and decided together to hijack a small plane and fly it from Leningrad to Sweden. Why Sweden? Because hijacking a bigger plane would have been considered criminal not only by the Soviet government, but by the larger international community the dissidents wanted to impress. And you couldn't fly to Israel on a biplane. So, Sweden, why not? Any point on the map outside the red line would do. The KGB got them before they boarded the plane. When the story broke and two men were accused of high treason, several world leaders intervened on their behalf. The Soviet leadership was pressured to open the borders to allow Jews to immigrate to their historical homeland, to Israel. I mapped this information on the plot of my own life and wonder. At the time when I sat in the fortress under my father's desk in Riga and stared at my father's felt boots, was he already involved in this conspiracy? In my memory, the scene of our last winter in Riga is lodged so firmly as if I had spent long months playing silently by his side, whereas my mother claims that he had left for Leningrad as early as October and stayed there. She insists that even before he left, I'd come down with strep throat, then progressed to scarlet fever and eventually to pneumonia, and didn't fully recover until the next spring. The prospect of losing his only son didn't stop my father, she says. She sounds bitter. Should I be grateful that my father's hijacking plot helped my mother and me and so many others to escape the USSR and come to Israel? We left the Soviet Union in 1971, shortly after the trial. When my father joined us 6 years later, I was 10 years old. I'd forgotten most of my Russian by then, and I didn't want to believe he was my father. He wore giant glasses that covered most of his face and hid his eyes behind the massive lenses. His clothes hung loosely about his body, and his back was stooped as if he were 100 years old. My mother had trouble recognizing him. They'd only known each other a short time before they were married, and by this point had lived apart twice as long as they'd spent together. My father, I did not know him. I preferred to think of him in the collective sense, as just one in a number of my forefathers. All the men who made me the person I am today by virtue of their absence. We do not have a common language, my forefathers and I. We do not believe in the same things. If I had been in their place, then what? Would I have stayed in Riga in the Soviet Union? I remember that comfortable room with the hot stove and the bronze wallpaper and the desk, my fortress, and I know that I wouldn't have left. I would find other means of protest. I would stay put. I would care the most about the people closest to me. I would not let myself abandon my son, haunting my ex-wife's basement, drinking my life away until the only things I have left are fragments of obscure poetry ringing in my ears.